In the deep heart of Mississippi, where the air was thick with the scent of magnolia and misery, there stood a plantation that symbolized both the wealth and wickedness of the South. Its white columns gleamed in the sunlight, its fields stretched endlessly, and its people, enslaved men and women, worked beneath a sky that never seemed to look away. But beyond the grand facade of prosperity and power, the Bellemere plantation held a secret so vile that even time itself seemed ashamed to remember it. In the year 1843, whispers began to spread across the neighboring towns. Travelers, merchants, and slaves spoke of a certain plantation owner, a man known for his vast wealth, fine manners, and deep ties to the local church. He was called Silas Bellemere, a man whose name was spoken with both admiration and dread. To the world, he was a man of faith, a loyal husband, and a proud father of 2 sons, but behind the locked doors of his estate, he had become something else, something monstrous. Silas believed himself to be chosen not by God, but by destiny. He had read in the Bible that man was created in God's image, and in his arrogance he interpreted that to mean he had the right to shape life as he pleased. What began as curiosity about breeding stronger workers turned into an obsession with bloodlines, purity, and control. Soon the plantation became a living experiment in domination, where enslaved women were not seen as people, but as instruments of wealth. The horror deepened when Silas's obsession spread like a sickness through his household. His wife, Evelyn Bellemere, a woman of fragile beauty and devout faith, had long endured her husband's cruelty in silence, but when Silas declared that the family bloodline must be expanded, that even their sons must take part, the house of God that Evelyn had once prayed in felt more like a grave. The plantation became a place of twisted rituals, where faith was used to justify depravity, and silence became the only form of survival. The enslaved women who lived under the Bellemere rule learned quickly that the night carried no safety. They were forced into rooms where prayers turned to screams, and where each birth brought not joy but terror, for their children might be taken, sold, or claimed as property of their own blood. Some of these women spoke later of Evelyn's shadow watching from the hallway, her face pale, her hands trembling, her lips moving in silent prayer as she witnessed what no wife or mother should. Others claimed she would weep beside the stables, whispering to the horses as though confessing sins too great for any priest to hear. By 1843, rumors had reached the nearby town of Lexington. There were stories of strange births, of children who bore uncanny resemblance to the Bellemere family. There were whispers that the mistress had begun to lose her mind, and that one of the sons had fled after discovering the truth about his own half-brothers, boys sold at auction whose faces mirrored his own. But the walls of the South were built to keep such truths contained. The church took its donations, the neighbors turned their heads. The slaves who spoke risked the whip, the noose, or worse. Still, history has a way of remembering what men try to bury. When the plantation eventually burned, no one knows how or by whose hand, the flames seemed to rise higher than the heavens themselves, as if to cleanse the earth of what had been done there. The ashes of Bellemere Hall became legend, a warning whispered through generations. And yet, in old diaries and faded letters found decades later, one message repeats itself again and again. Evil does not die, it only hides in silence. The story of the Bellemere family is not just one of cruelty. It is the story of how power can turn holy men into devils, and how silence can become the loudest accomplice of all. In 1843 Mississippi, the plantation class ruled like gods on earth. They dined beneath chandeliers, prayed in whitewashed churches, and spoke of honor as if it were their birthright. They wrote poetry about chivalry, about the purity of womanhood, and about the noble duty of Christian men to guide the lesser races. Their speeches, their clothes, even their hospitality, all dripped with the perfume of civilization. But behind the lace curtains and polished silver, that civility was a thin, fragile mask hiding rot. No man embodied that contradiction more perfectly than Silas Bellemere, the master of Bellemere Plantation. To the world, he was a Southern gentleman, educated in Charleston, respected in the legislature, and praised for his charity. He donated to the church, built schools, and entertained preachers at his table. On Sundays, he stood in the front pew with his wife Evelyn and his two handsome sons, a living portrait of piety and order. But when the church bells stopped ringing and the curtains were drawn, the illusion of nobility turned to something far darker. Silas's plantation was not merely a place of labor. It was an empire of bodies. Hundreds of enslaved men and women worked the cotton fields, the kitchens, and the breeding sheds. To his neighbors, he was a model of good management, admired for how productive his plantation was. But what they did not see, or refused to see, was that Silas viewed human life the same way he viewed cattle. Every child born on the plantation was a calculation of profit. Every woman's body was an investment. Every act of cruelty was justified in the language of economics and faith. To outsiders, Silas spoke with the calm confidence of a scholar. He quoted scripture to justify his beliefs, twisting verses to defend his dominion over the enslaved. "The sons of Ham shall serve," he would say, his tone scholarly, as if citing divine law. Even his wife Evelyn believed that her husband was simply following the order of creation. Yet beneath that self-righteous calm, Silas carried a secret hunger, one that would destroy everything he claimed to love. It began, as many horrors do, with whispers. Visitors to the plantation noticed that the enslaved children often bore uncanny resemblances to the master himself. Some had his gray eyes, others his sharp chin or proud posture. When asked about it, Silas would laugh softly and deflect. "Strong blood breeds strong hands," he'd say. "The Lord rewards those who tend the soil with care." The neighbors, bound by greed and guilt, said nothing. For in the South, silence was the currency of survival. The illusion of nobility extended to every part of the Belmare world. The house itself was built to impress. The white columns, the marble floors, the grand piano imported from Boston. Guests marveled at its splendor, never realizing that every brick had been laid by hands that would never know freedom. Even the gardens, famous across the county for their roses, were watered with the sweat of those who were never seen. It was beauty built on blood, civility constructed from cruelty. Evelyn Bellemare, Silas's wife, embodied the Southern ideal of womanhood, graceful, soft-spoken, devoted. But she too was a prisoner of appearance. Her gowns and jewels could not hide the emptiness in her eyes, nor the bruises that sometimes bloomed beneath her lace collars. She smiled for guests, played the piano for visiting pastors, and spoke lovingly of her husband's generosity. But late at night she would sit by the window, staring out at the fields lit by moonlight, where human silhouettes moved like ghosts among the rows of cotton. The true nature of Belmare nobility was not written in letters or recorded in sermons. It was whispered in the slave quarters. They called Silas the preacher of pain. He would sometimes force the enslaved to kneel before him as he read from the Bible, then order punishments immediately afterward. "The Lord disciplines those he loves," he'd say, before turning away as the whip cracked through the air. His sons watched and learned. One, Thomas, began imitating his father's mannerisms. The other, Samuel, recoiled in horror. Two boys, one molded in cruelty, the other haunted by it. It was said that Silas once told Evelyn that their wealth was proof of God's blessing. She did not argue, but she prayed differently after that. No longer for prosperity, but for mercy. There were days when she could no longer tell where faith ended and fear began. The Bible on her nightstand became a talisman, not a comfort. Her lips moved in prayer, but her eyes stayed open, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside her door. Every Sunday, the Belmare family rode into town in their polished carriage, a picture of grace. The pastor always praised them for their godly example. Children watched them pass and dreamed of growing up to be like them. But none of those children saw the truth, that the Belmare legacy was built not on faith or family, but on control. The same hands that clasped in prayer also gripped the whip. The same mouth that quoted scripture also whispered commands in the dark. The facade of Southern nobility was never about morality, it was about maintaining power. It was theater designed to convince the world that cruelty could be respectable, that domination could be divine. Men like Silas Bellemare turned evil into ritual and made it look like duty. They didn't see themselves as monsters, they saw themselves as architects of civilization. But facades, no matter how polished, always crack. For every portrait that hung in Belmare Hall, there was another story whispered in the slave cabins. For every hymn sung in church, there was a scream swallowed by the night. The South built its empire on that silence, on women like Evelyn who could not speak, on men like Silas who would not stop, and on generations who pretended not to see. By 1843, the cracks had begun to show. Evelyn had stopped attending church. One of the sons had left the plantation altogether. The enslaved had begun to pass messages in code, marking trees and stones to prepare for something unspeakable. The world still saw nobility, but the walls of the Belmare Empire were beginning to whisper, and those whispers would soon turn to fire. The Belmare Plantation stood in Mississippi's heart, where the soil was rich and red, and the wealth of men was measured in acres and bodies. To outsiders, Silas Belmare was the picture of Southern nobility, a man of charm, religion, and refinement. His mansion gleamed under the humid sun, its tall white columns stretching like the ribs of a beast trying to hide its heart. But within those walls, beneath the hymns of evening prayers and the rustle of magnolia leaves, there pulsed a secret so vile that even whispers dared not escape. The plantation was more than a place of work. It was a machine, a dark factory for human life. Unlike most slaveholders who relied on the auction blocks of New Orleans or Charleston, Silas had his own method of expansion. He believed in self-sufficiency, which to him meant controlling every birth, every womb, every drop of blood that could serve his wealth. It wasn't enough to own people, he wanted to breed them. He called it the program. To his overseers and trusted associates, it was nothing short of a cold, calculated system of human engineering. Young enslaved women were selected, not for their strength or skill, but for their fertility and healthy stock. The chosen men were often the strongest, the ones who could survive back-breaking labor and still stand tall at the end of the day. But there was no dignity in the process, no humanity. It was done under threat, under the watch of whips and guns. Belmare kept records, names, birth dates, measurements, and offspring count. Each child was assigned a number, each woman's productivity noted in ledgers written in fine ink. He saw them as property, as investment, and every time a child was born, it meant one more slave he didn't have to buy. It meant more money, more labor, more power. The twisted efficiency of it all made him proud, but behind that pride lurked something even darker. Silas's obsession with purity and control didn't stop with the enslaved. He had a deep-seated fixation with bloodlines, a grotesque curiosity that turned into perversion. His wife, Margaret, was a fragile woman, worn down by years of silence and humiliation. Unable to bear children herself, she endured the unimaginable, being forced to watch her husband take enslaved women in front of her. Silas claimed it was for the future of the plantation, that it was God's will to prosper. Margaret knew better. It was power, it was lust, and it was madness. There were nights when screams echoed through the barn, not from punishment, but from the horror of forced unions. Silas's sons, raised under their father's brutal hand, learned early what dominance meant. By the time they were teenagers, they too took part, treating the enslaved women as their inheritance, their right. The Belmare lineage was not only built on cruelty, but on incestuous violence that blurred the lines between master and monster. As the years passed, rumors began to spread through the neighboring counties. Strange features in some of the slave children, pale skin, gray eyes, auburn hair, began to betray the bloodlines of their masters. The townsfolk whispered that Silas's stock looked too much like his own kin. Yet none dared confront him. His influence was vast. His money bought silence. Even the local preacher, whose sermons cried against sin, dined at Belmare's table and blessed the plantation's crops without ever looking too closely at the people who harvested them. Margaret's sanity unraveled slowly. Every child born of Silas's wickedness was a dagger to her soul. Some said she took to wandering the fields at night, whispering lullabies to the enslaved children, calling them hers. Others claimed she prayed for the house to burn to the ground. Her frail figure became a ghostly sight, a symbol of guilt and powerlessness in a place ruled by cruelty. But the enslaved saw everything. They endured. They waited. Among them, hope still flickered, quiet, dangerous hope. In whispers passed through the quarters, in glances exchanged between women who had suffered too much, a plan began to take shape. Freedom was no longer a dream, it was a necessity. They knew the cost, but they also knew the cost of doing nothing. Meanwhile, Silas continued his breeding program as if it were divine duty. He wrote letters to other plantation owners, boasting of his results. Some even came to visit, to observe the system. These men left in awe, calling him a visionary, a man who had turned morality into economics. None saw the horror, or perhaps they did, and they simply didn't care. In the South of 1843, profit justified anything. The plantation became a living hell, a place where innocence was manufactured and destroyed in the same breath. For every child born, a piece of humanity died. The barns smelled of hay and fear, the air thick with cries no one dared record. It wasn't just slavery, it was breeding, a word that stripped away the last fragment of dignity from those who had already lost everything. Yet, history has a way of swallowing such evils in silence. Records of Belmare Plantation were destroyed after the war. Fires consumed the ledgers, and the mansion itself fell into ruin. But stories remained. Descendants of the enslaved spoke of the blood children, those born with the faces of their masters. Old songs carried the memory, hidden in verses about a man who made the sun cry. The breeding plantation was more than one man's sin. It was a mirror of the South's rotting heart. It revealed how power could twist faith, how wealth could breed wickedness, and how cruelty could masquerade as progress. Silas Belmare died believing he was a visionary, but history remembers him, when it dares to remember him at all, as something else entirely. A monster, not the kind from nightmares, but the kind that smiles in daylight, prays on Sunday, and calls his crimes God's work. The Belmare Plantation stood as his empire, an empire built on the bodies of women, on the cries of children, and on the silence of a wife who watched until watching was all she could do. And long after the mansion fell and the fields turned wild again, locals swore that on humid Mississippi. Nights, if you walked near the ruins, you could still hear the echoes, the sounds of chains and newborn cries, rising from the earth that had drunk too much blood to ever sleep peacefully again. Margaret Belmare was once known as the Rose of Natchez, a woman of grace, manners, and beauty. Before her marriage, she had come from a respected Southern family, taught to play piano, read poetry, and host lavish dinners that made men talk and women envy. But when she married Silas Belmare, her life became a haunting portrait of Southern womanhood at its most fragile, gilded on the outside, shattered within. The world saw her as blessed. She had a mansion, fine clothes, and a husband who appeared devout. But behind the lace curtains and polished silver, Margaret lived in a private hell, one carved from betrayal and humiliation. Her inability to bear children was a wound her husband never let her forget. In the 1840s, a wife's worth in the South was tied to her fertility. A barren woman was seen as broken, cursed, or unfit. Silas turned that cultural cruelty into a personal weapon. At first it was subtle. Silence at the dinner table when the topic of children arose, cold glances when he passed her in the hallway, the lingering pause when he looked at the portraits of families in church. Then, one evening, the mask fell completely. Margaret found him in the barn, the very place where slaves were kept after dusk, with one of the young women, no more than 17. The act was not of love, but of domination. It was deliberate, staged even, for she knew he wanted her to see. When she screamed, he turned calmly and said, "You may not give me children, but she will." From that night forward, Margaret's world darkened. She became both witness and prisoner to his depravity. Silas forced her to attend the birthing nights, calling it accounting for God's blessings. She was made to stand in the corner of the barn while enslaved women gave birth to her husband's offspring. Children she was forbidden to touch or name, yet forced to acknowledge as part of the Belmare legacy. The humiliation broke something inside her. Servants whispered that she stopped eating for days, that she spoke to herself, that she would sit for hours in the nursery that was never used, clutching a single silver rattle. At night, she was seen walking through the fields, barefoot, whispering prayers to no one. But Margaret was not just a victim, she was also an unwilling accomplice to the horror. She kept silent, not only out of fear of her husband, but out of the societal chains that bound her as tightly as any shackle. A Southern woman of her standing could not speak out. To do so would mean ruin, shame, and isolation. her family would disown her, her church would condemn her, and society would brand her mad. So she did what many women of her class did. She suffered quietly and obeyed publicly. Over time, her silence became a ghostly presence in the house. The slaves whispered that the missus walks like death, moving from room to room like a mourning spirit. Children avoided her eyes, and the staff said the air turned cold wherever she passed. Some believed she had gone insane, while others said she was simply biding her time, that she carried a secret vengeance in her heart, too dangerous to speak aloud. There were moments, though rare, when the woman she once was seemed to flicker back to life. Once, she gave an enslaved woman her late mother's rosary, whispering, "You'll need this more than I ever did." On another occasion, she tried to free one of the children Silas had fathered, sending him north with a trader's wife who pitied her. When Silas found out, he beat her so severely that she couldn't walk for weeks. From that day forward, she spoke no more of mercy. As her mind deteriorated, her reality became a tapestry of blurred visions and guilt. She saw her reflection in every enslaved mother's eyes, women trapped in bodies they didn't own, enduring pain for the pleasure and profit of men. And she began to question her faith. The Bible that once sat proudly on her bedside table became a source of torment. She read the verses about obedience and sin and began to wonder, had God turned away from this place, or had he never been here at all? Margaret's final breaking point came when she discovered that Silas had begun involving their sons in his vile acts, teaching them manhood, as he called it. She begged him to stop, fell to her knees, even threatened to leave. He laughed in her face and said, "You'll leave when I say you can. Until then, you'll keep your mouth shut and your eyes open." That night, she locked herself in her room and burned every letter and portrait she owned. The flames reflected in her eyes like the birth of madness. By dawn, she had gone eerily calm. From that day on, she stopped wearing color. She dressed only in black, her hair unpinned and wild. The townsfolk began to whisper that the plantation's mistress had turned witch-like, cursing the house with her grief. But in truth, Margaret was already dead inside, a woman hollowed out by years of cruelty. She began to spend her nights sitting by the barn, listening to the cries of newborns and the groans of the enslaved, her face pale and blank as moonlight. She no longer prayed for salvation, she prayed for an end. Years later, when the fire that consumed the Belmare plantation came, no one saw Margaret flee. Some said she started it herself, wandering through the halls with a candle, smiling for the first time in years. Others claimed she was seen standing in the fields as the flames rose behind her, whispering to the ashes, "Now you're all free." Whether she lived or died that night, no one knows. But those who visit the ruins of the plantation say they can still feel her presence, the sorrow of a woman who bore witness to evil and carried the guilt of silence until it consumed her. Margaret Belmare's agony was not just her own. It was the echo of every woman trapped by power, decorum, and fear. She was the quiet ghost of the South, mourning the lives destroyed in her home, too powerless to stop it, too human to forget it. And so her name vanished from the records, but her story did not. It lived in whispers, in the shivering leaves of the Mississippi oaks, in the cries of night creatures that sound eerily like weeping. The mistress of Belmare Plantation became a symbol, not of beauty, but of tragedy. A woman who stood at the crossroads of privilege and damnation, watching as everything around her burned, including herself. The Belmare sons, Charles and Edwin, were the living reflections of their father's sins, molded in his shadow and raised within the twisted logic of absolute power. From birth, they were told that their name carried legacy, land, and divine right, that they were chosen to rule. But what they inherited was not nobility, it was corruption masquerading as destiny. Charles, the eldest, was calm and meticulous, his father's perfect heir in every way. From the time he could walk, Silas had him accompany him to the cotton fields, not to learn labor or compassion, but to learn control. "A man's worth," Silas would say, "is measured by how many obey him without question." Those words would become Charles's creed. Edwin, younger by 3 years, was different. Restless, curious, and more emotional. He sometimes flinched at the screams that came from the barns at night. Once, when he was only 9, he asked his father why the slaves cried so often. Silas smiled coldly and said, "Pain teaches obedience. You'll understand when you're a man." From that day, Edwin learned not to ask questions, but he never stopped feeling them. Their mother, Margaret, tried to protect them when they were young, hiding the truth behind the illusion of Southern gentility. But as the boys grew, Silas took control of their education. Tutors were replaced with overseers, preachers replaced with planters who spoke of property and bloodlines. By their teenage years, the Belmare sons had learned how to tally slave births, price field hands, and break wills. The plantation was a school of cruelty, and their father was its headmaster. When Charles turned 16, Silas brought him to the barn one stormy night. Margaret screamed when she realized what was happening but was locked in her room. Inside the barn, Silas told Charles that it was time he learned the ways of a man. He forced his son to watch as he selected one of the young enslaved women, a girl barely older than Charles himself. Her name was Ruth. When Charles hesitated, Silas struck him and said, "This is your right. Do it." Charles obeyed, and something in him died that night. But worse, something else was born. From then on, Charles became a mirror of his father. He began to treat the enslaved with an icy detachment, as though they were part of the machinery of the plantation. He would later tell Edwin, "Father was right. Mercy is for the poor. We are not poor." Edwin watched the transformation with horror. The brother he had admired became a ghost in fine clothes, empty eyes, cruel smile. At times, Edwin would try to reach him, to talk about what they had seen their father do, but Charles would silence him. "Do not speak of it," he'd whisper. "We are Belmares. We don't confess, we rule." Years passed, and the two brothers took over more of the plantation's operations. Under their management, cruelty became routine. Enslaved women were forced into pairings to increase the labor force, and any sign of resistance was met with punishment. Charles oversaw it all, meticulous as ever, keeping records of each birth and death in his father's thick leather ledger. But Edwin began to drift further from his family. He started spending long hours in the fields, talking to the workers when no one was watching. He began to understand the weight of their fear, the hopelessness in their eyes, and with that understanding came guilt. One night, Edwin discovered something that shattered what little innocence he had left. His father had fathered children with the enslaved women, and those children were being raised as slaves, his half-siblings, his blood. He confronted his father, trembling with rage. "They're ours, father. You're selling your own blood." Silas looked at him with disgust and said, "My blood makes them valuable." That moment broke Edwin's spirit. From then on, he lived in quiet torment, torn between his conscience and his name. He began to write secretly, journals filled with confessions, sketches of the people his family had destroyed, and letters he would never send. In one he wrote, "The devil does not live in hell. He lives at Belmare." Charles, meanwhile, rose higher in power and cruelty. He inherited his father's confidence, his charisma, and his capacity for justification. He truly believed that the Belmares were building an empire, not realizing that empire was rotting from within. By the time Silas grew old and ill, Charles had become his reflection in full. He began referring to the plantation workers as breeders, a term that chilled even the most hardened overseers. The women knew that when Charles walked through the barns at night, someone would not come out until morning. Margaret, broken and ghost-like, saw the same darkness take root in her sons that had once consumed her husband. In her rare lucid moments, she begged them to stop, to burn the records, to end the bloodline before it spread further. But Charles only sneered. "Mother, you raised us in this house. The fire's already in our blood. When Silas finally died, it was not a peaceful passing. The slaves said his last words were not prayers, but names, the names of the children he had sold." Charles held his hand as he died, and Edwin stood in the corner, unable to weep. After the funeral, Charles assumed control fully. The plantation became colder, more efficient, more mechanical. The slaves whispered that the devil had not died, he had simply changed faces. Edwin, unable to bear it, vanished one night. Some said he fled north. Others believed he stayed nearby, hiding in the woods, planning revenge. A year later, the Great Fire came. It began in the barns, spreading fast through the dry fields. Witnesses saw two figures running, one tall and composed, the other limping, carrying a lantern. No one knows who struck the first flame, but when it was over, the Belmare plantation was gone. Among the ashes, they found a charred body near the steps of the main house. It was clutching a silver rosary, Margaret's. Another body, presumed to be Charles, was found in the barn, the place where his father had taught him to become a man. Edwin's body was never found. Some say he lit the fire, others say the ghosts of the enslaved did, but one thing is certain: the sins of the Bellemare sons did not die with them. Travelers who pass the ruins at night swear they hear two voices, one calm, one crying, arguing among the ashes, a reminder that evil once taught is never easily buried. The Bellemare name vanished from Mississippi's records, erased by shame, but its story remained, a tale of sons born not into legacy, but into damnation. The Bellemare Plantation was not just a place of toil and terror, it was an industry of flesh. Beneath its columns and magnolia-lined paths, human lives were measured not by heart or soul, but by lineage. To outsiders, Silas Bellemare's estate symbolized prosperity. To those within its fences, it was a breeding ground where the price of a child depended on the color of its skin and the power in its father's veins. The twisted logic of the market of bloodlines had been born out of Silas's greed and obsession with legacy. His cotton yields were respectable but never exceptional, and his debts grew with every new expansion. Then, sometime in the late 1830s, he discovered a far more profitable trade: people. More specifically, the breeding of people. It began as a quiet practice, whispered about only among the wealthiest planters. Instead of purchasing new slaves, they began forcing those they already owned to reproduce, turning birth into a form of labor. Each newborn meant another worker, another sale, another ounce of profit. But Silas took the system to monstrous extremes. To him, it wasn't enough to breed for strength or endurance. He wanted purity, a perverse blend of whiteness and servitude that blurred the boundaries between master and property. He claimed it was about improving the stock, but in truth, it was about control. Each child born of his design was proof of his power, even nature bent to his will. Records found years later described the methodical precision of his cruelty. Silas kept ledgers, meticulously noting every pairing, the date of conception, the mother's condition, and the value of the offspring. In the margins, he used words like strong breed, useful for domestic, and sell at New Orleans. He had reduced humanity to arithmetic. But what made the Bellemare operation uniquely horrifying was that his own bloodlines began to intertwine with those of the enslaved. Silas, his sons, and even overseers were ordered, sometimes forced, to impregnate women chosen for their strength, beauty, or docility. These children, born of violence, were given no names from the Bible, only first names assigned by record. They were raised as slaves, unaware that their master shared their blood. In the house, whispers of these mulatto children became impossible to ignore. Some bore the unmistakable eyes of their father or the sharp chin of the Bellemare sons. Yet Silas called them servants of the Lord, and any suggestion of kinship was punished by the whip. The hypocrisy was staggering. A man who preached purity while creating the very impurity he condemned. Margaret Bellemare, broken by grief, tried at first to hide these children from her sight, but they were everywhere, in the kitchens, in the gardens, in the fields. Her husband's sins had filled every corner of her home. Eventually, she stopped attending church, unable to bear the sermons about virtue and sin that mirrored her life too closely. The system spread beyond Bellemare. Neighbors began to copy his methods, impressed by his financial success. Improved breeding practices, they called it, a sanitized phrase for forced reproduction. Silas became a quiet legend among planters, his plantation a grim model of efficiency. He even hosted gatherings where he discussed management techniques, as if discussing livestock. But while the white elites praised him, the enslaved carried the weight of his cruelty. The women lived in constant dread, not of backbreaking labor, but of the nights when the master or his sons came to their quarters. There was no safety, no refuge, not even in pregnancy. Many of them died giving birth, their bodies broken from repeated exploitation. Those who survived lived only to see their children sold. There were stories of mothers who tried to run, who hid their newborns in the woods rather than let them be taken. Some succeeded, most did not. The overseers were merciless, hunting them down with dogs. The punishments were public, designed to terrify others into compliance. But among the enslaved, a quiet rebellion grew, in whispers, in songs, in the coded language of grief. They sang lullabies not for peace, but for remembrance. Lines like, "My baby ain't for sale, Lord. My baby ain't for sale," carried through the night air, soft enough to escape the ears of the masters, but strong enough to keep memory alive. Silas, ever proud, saw the plantation's prosperity as divine favor. He would boast that God rewards the fruitful. The irony was that his wealth was built on the destruction of fruitfulness itself. Women forced to bear children who would never know their fathers, and fathers who were ordered to forget their own blood. But profit made him blind. He began sending the mixed-race children to markets farther away, fearing local gossip. Ships bound for Louisiana and South Carolina carried dozens of his stock, some of them barely 10 years old. The slave traders admired his discipline and quality control. Behind their praise lay the stench of horror, the normalization of evil so complete that it passed for business. The turning point came when one of Silas's own children, by blood, was sold by mistake. A girl named Eliza, light-skinned and bright-eyed, who resembled Margaret as much as Silas. She was only 12 when a new overseer, unaware of her origins, listed her for sale in Natchez. Silas didn't stop it. Some said he did it deliberately, to hide the resemblance, to erase the evidence. When Margaret learned the truth, something inside her finally broke beyond repair. That night, she tried to burn the ledger where Eliza's name was written. Silas caught her and struck her down. The ledger survived, her will did not. From that moment, the plantation carried a curse in spirit, if not in name. The crops began to fail, the workers whispered of hauntings, and the Belmare sons turned on each other. But still, the market of bloodlines continued, until the night the fire came. When the ruins were excavated decades later, pieces of that ledger were found in the ash, the ink still faintly legible. Among the records of names, dates, and values, one final note appeared in Silas's handwriting: "They are all mine, the black, the white, the dead, the living. My seed fills this land." It was not a confession, it was a declaration, and with it the full horror of Belmare's market was revealed. A place where humanity was not lost by accident but by design, where the blood of oppressor and oppressed mingled in the soil, and where generations were born not from love, but from greed. Even now, historians speak of Belmare's records with dread. They were not just evidence of one man's sin, they were a mirror to an entire system that thrived on the same belief, that power could own life itself. But as the years passed, the voices that Silas tried to silence found new ways to speak, through the stories, the songs, the names whispered in the dark. The bloodlines he thought he owned had outlived him, and the empire he built on suffering turned to ash. For the first time, the price of his legacy was clear, a debt written not in coin but in blood. By the winter of 1843, the Belmare plantation was a place heavy with silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, like something waiting. The fields lay barren, the enslaved moved with hollow eyes, and the mansion that once hosted lavish dinners now echoed with arguments and footsteps of ghosts. The air itself carried tension, as though the land remembered every scream, every betrayal, and every unburied sin. Silas Belmare, now in his late 50s, still ruled the plantation with an iron will. But time had begun to warp him. His once sharp eyes were clouded with suspicion. His body grew frail, yet his cruelty remained intact. His sons had grown crueler than their father, violent, reckless, and eager to outdo one another in dominance. The plantation that had once operated with cold efficiency was now chaotic, ruled by paranoia and blood. But beneath that decay, something else was stirring, something long suppressed, a storm of vengeance that began not in rage, but in quiet grief. Among the enslaved was a woman named Nora, a house servant with a haunted look and a scar across her neck, a scar left by Silas's whip when she'd once begged for mercy for her child. That child, born of Silas's own hand, had been sold at just 6 years old. For years, Nora had endured, her body broken but her mind alive, and now she was done enduring. The plan began with whispers. Late at night, when the moonlight slipped through the cracks in the quarters, Nora gathered a small group, men and women who had lost everything. There was Ezekiel, a field hand whose wife had been assigned to one of Silas's sons, Lydia, who had given birth to 3 children and buried 2, and old Ben, who had seen the plantation rise from its first brick. Together, they shared what no whip could destroy: memory. The rebellion was not meant to free them, it was meant to end him. They waited for Christmas Eve, a night when the masters would drink themselves into a stupor, celebrating the birth of Christ while ignoring their own damnation. That night, the Bellemare mansion glowed with candlelight. The family dined, their laughter echoing through halls lined with portraits of ancestors, men who looked as proud and ruthless as Silas himself. Nora moved through the dining room quietly, pouring wine and serving plates, her face blank, but her heart pounding like a drum. She had hidden a small flask of kerosene beneath her skirt. In the kitchens, Ezekiel and Lydia prepared the feast, and slipped oil-soaked rags beneath the woodpile. By midnight the plan was set. The enslaved quarters, the barns, the fields, all had been doused with traces of oil carried in secret for weeks. Old Ben stood by the outer fences holding a single torch. His hands trembled, but not from fear. "Let the Lord judge," he whispered, before touching the flame to the dry straw. The fire spread faster than breath. Within moments, the barns erupted, horses screamed, and the night turned orange. The mansion's windows flickered with light as Silas stumbled outside, shouting orders, his voice drowned by chaos. But when he turned toward the flames, he saw something that froze him. The enslaved were not trying to put it out. They were watching. For the first time in his life, Silas saw their eyes, not as property, not as fear, but as judgment. The flames leapt from barn to kitchen, from kitchen to the main house. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Margaret, pale and half-mad, wandered through the halls, clutching her husband's ledger, the record of every life he had destroyed. When she saw the fire approaching, she did not run. She opened the book, tore a page, and whispered, "Let it all burn." Then she walked into the smoke. Silas tried to flee toward the stables, but Ezekiel caught him at the door. The two men stood face to face, one broken by years of labor, the other by years of sin. Silas tried to speak, but Ezekiel struck him with the butt of a rifle. "For my wife," he said, "for my blood." When the fire reached the main hall, it roared through the wooden beams, devouring everything: the portraits, the silver, the fine furniture, the very history of the Bellemare name. Silas was last seen crawling through the dirt, calling for his sons, who had already fled into the woods. None returned. By dawn, the plantation was gone. All that remained were blackened ruins and silence. The enslaved who survived the night gathered on the edge of the fields. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared at the smoke rising into the morning sky. For them it was not freedom, but it was justice. When authorities arrived days later, they found the mansion reduced to ash. Charred bodies lay where the great dining table once stood. Among them was Silas Bellemare, or what was left of him, his hands clutching the ground as though trying to hold on to the earth he had claimed as his own. They called it the Bellemare tragedy. Newspapers in Mississippi and beyond printed stories of a mysterious fire that destroyed one of the state's most prosperous plantations. Few dared to print the truth, that it was an act of rebellion, a reckoning. But the enslaved knew. They carried the story with them as they were sold, freed, or scattered. They told their children in hushed voices about the night the fire came, about the woman named Nora who lit the match, and about the master who finally met the flames he'd kindled in others. Years later, travelers claimed to see lights flickering in the ruins on winter nights, faint golden glows that moved like candles. Locals called it the Bellemare fire. They said if you listened close enough, you could hear the crackle of flames and the sound of a woman singing in the smoke. Perhaps it was just superstition, or perhaps the land itself refused to forget. Because the fire did more than destroy a plantation, it erased a legacy built on cruelty and reshaped it into a warning. Every ember that burned that night carried the weight of a century of pain. Every scream that echoed through the night became part of the soil, part of the memory of the South. And though Silas Bellemare's name was struck from the county records, his story remained in whispers, of a man who bred evil in pursuit of wealth, and of the night that evil burned him alive. The plantation that once stood as a monument to power became something else entirely, a graveyard of greed. And in that graveyard, one truth endured through generations: there comes a night when even the masters must answer to their slaves. When the Bellemare plantation fell to ashes in the winter of 1843, The fire might have devoured its wood and stone, but it couldn't consume the stain that lived in the family's bloodline. The story of Silas Bellemare, the man who bred human lives like cattle, who crossed the lines between family and slavery, didn't end with his death. It began again in whispers, nightmares, and shadows that clung to his surviving sons. The Bellemare name was cursed after the fire. The surviving sons, Jonathan, Elias, and Henry Bellemare, disappeared into the countryside. They changed their names, scattered across the South, and tried to build new lives away from the ashes of Mississippi, but each carried something dark inside, something their father had planted long before the fire ever started. The idea that they were gods among men, that others existed for their power, their pleasure, their control. Jonathan, the eldest, settled near Savannah, Georgia, claiming to be a businessman. He married into money, purchased land, and hired workers, some free, some not. But those who worked for him said strange things happened on his property. Livestock found mutilated, fields that grew lush one season turned barren the next. And at night, from the attic of the grand house he built, the neighbors swore they heard voices, a woman's sobs, a man's screams, and sometimes the crackle of invisible flames. Jonathan died young, found hanging from a rafter in that same attic. His death was ruled suicide, but locals said his body was surrounded by burn marks, as if the fire that consumed his father had come to claim him too. Elias, the middle son, fled west to Arkansas, taking with him a small wooden chest his father had kept locked for years. Inside were ledgers, family documents, and something else, a bundle of letters from enslaved women Silas had kept in the house. The letters were not written by them, but about them. Detailed notes on their bodies, their children, their breeding potential. Elias carried that chest like a holy relic, claiming it was proof of the family's divine legacy. He built a small community in the backwoods, convincing others that he was a prophet chosen to restore order after the collapse of moral society. The locals called it the Bellemare Colony. At first it was just strange sermons and whispers about blood purity, but soon Elias began to repeat his father's sins, taking women as property, using them to produce perfect offspring. By 1852, the colony was gone. No one knows what happened. Travelers reported finding the compound burned to the ground, every hut and chapel blackened. Only Elias's charred remains were found, his hands fused to the chest he had carried for years. The youngest, Henry, made his way to New Orleans, where he became a doctor. He was educated, charming, and for a time, respected, but even he could not escape the family's rot. His fascination with anatomy turned into obsession. He began experimenting on the bodies of the poor, first the dead, then the living. He justified it in letters. I seek to understand what my father failed to master, the limits of creation. By 1856, authorities discovered a hidden chamber beneath his clinic, filled with preserved corpses and surgical journals. Henry was never captured. Some said he fled to Europe. Others claimed the people he experimented on found him first and made him pay. So the fire that began in Mississippi had spread across the South, not of wood and flame, but of blood and madness. The Bellemare curse had become a story told by midwives and priests alike. Beware the sin that breeds itself. But the story did not end there. In the decades that followed, strange coincidences continued to haunt the land where the Bellemare Plantation once stood. No crops grew where the main house had been. No animals survived a night near the old well. Travelers reported seeing the figure of a woman walking through the smoke at dusk, holding a child, her dress still smoldering. Some said it was Nora, the enslaved woman who led the rebellion. Others said it was Margaret Bellemare, forever searching for her lost children in the ashes. But those who lived nearby didn't care which it was. They simply called her the Lady of Fire. In 1870, a preacher named Reverend Harlan tried to rebuild a church on the site, claiming he would purify the land through God's grace. During the first Sunday sermon, the church bell cracked without warning. By nightfall, the building burned down. No one rebuilt it again. What the Bellemares had created, the horrors, the desecration of bodies and souls, had soaked into the soil. Historians tried to erase it, calling it myth. Newspapers refused to print the truth, but the descendants of those enslaved remembered. They passed the tale through generations, not as a ghost story but as a warning. Even a century later, in 1943, when a historian named Dr. Samuel Hurst came to research the Belmare records, he wrote in his journal something chilling: "The documents are gone, but the land remembers. I cannot sleep here. I hear whispers, not from my mind but from the ground." He left the next morning and never returned. By then, the Belmare bloodline had vanished. No official descendants were ever traced. Some say the fire that took Silas and his sons was God's justice. Others believe the curse simply changed form, waiting dormant in the veins of someone who doesn't yet know their name. The story of the Belmare family became a forgotten footnote in Mississippi's history, but among the old families, those who still live near the ruins, one saying remains common: the Belmare don't die. They burn, and they wait, because curses don't end with death. They linger in memory, in stories whispered to children, in the way the wind changes when someone speaks their name. And perhaps that's the cruelest punishment of all. Not the fire, not the blood, but the legacy that refuses to die. For the Belmares, their true hell was not in the next life. It was in being remembered. When the Belmare estate burned to the ground in 1843, most believed that every trace of its dark history was destroyed. The ledgers, the letters, the birth lists, the receipts that turned human lives into accounting figures. But a century later, in the early 1940s, fragments began to resurface. Papers found in a church attic, a rusted lockbox discovered by a farmer's plow, and oral histories from descendants of the enslaved brought to light the horrifying precision of Silas Belmare's so-called experiment. Each record told the same story in different handwriting. This plantation wasn't just about wealth, it was about control. The documents revealed that Silas Belmare had meticulously tracked every pregnancy on his property, recording the date of conception, the pairings he enforced, and even the physical descriptions of newborns. He treated people like breeding animals, cataloging favorable traits as if running a cruel genetic trial long before the concept of eugenics had even been named. The horrifying twist: he included his own family's bloodline in these experiments, blurring the distinction between master and property, between kin and slave. The recovered ledgers were written in a calm, almost clinical tone. Female, 20 years of age. Conceived with master's son, condition satisfactory, issue expected May 12. But it wasn't only the words that terrified historians, it was what came next. Every ledger ended abruptly, as though someone had tried to erase the plantation's past from existence. Burn marks along the edges, missing pages, and sentences that stopped mid-thought suggested someone had destroyed the evidence in haste. And yet, not everything could be buried. Among the recovered items was a small bundle of letters from Margaret Belmare, Silas's wife. Her handwriting trembled with desperation, and her words exposed what polite Southern society had tried so hard to ignore. They call it progress. I call it damnation. I hear their cries every night, Silas. You call it birth. I call it sin. Her letters were never sent. They were found hidden beneath the floorboards of the plantation's main bedroom, sealed away with pieces of burnt parchment and what looked like fragments of hair ribbon belonging to a child. When historians pieced together the fragments, a larger picture began to form. Margaret had tried to expose her husband's atrocities. At least once, she attempted to write to local clergy and a judge in Jackson County, but her letters were intercepted. Silas had powerful friends, men who profited from his methods, who sent their own breeding slaves to Belmare for improvement. The scandal would have destroyed entire families across Mississippi. And so the truth was silenced. The missing church documents found in 1941 changed everything. They included baptism records from 1842, showing a list of children born to enslaved mothers but carrying the surnames of their white masters. Some of those names matched the Belmare sons, proof that the rumors of blood mixing were not mere gossip. These records also included a strange note scrawled in the margin of one page by the presiding priest: "The children bear resemblance too close for comfort. I fear we baptize sins born of pride." Soon after, that priest vanished from historical record. When journalists tried to publish findings from the rediscovered documents in 1943, they faced intense pressure. Two archives mysteriously caught fire within weeks of each other. One researcher, a man named Henry Dunford, died in what was officially called a barn accident. Another claimed he was followed by unknown men after leaving Mississippi. By the time World War II took public attention elsewhere, the Bellemare story had once again slipped into silence, but it never truly disappeared. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, activists rediscovered oral histories passed down through generations of black families. Elders told of a man called Master Burnhand, a cruel plantation owner who mixed his blood with ours and burned in his own fire. These stories aligned disturbingly with the Bellemare account. In some versions, Silas's spirit still walked the burned land, seeking those who shared his cursed blood. Others said the fire that took him was set not by accident, but by the women he had violated, led by one called Nora, the same name that appeared repeatedly in plantation birth records. Folklorists who visited the ruins in the 1970s described the land as eerily untouched. Trees refused to grow over certain spots. Metal detectors picked up traces of melted iron but no artifacts. Locals refused to step onto the property after sunset, insisting that the ground breathes. Some even reported hearing a baby's faint cry when the wind passed through the charred oak trees. A single photograph taken in 1974 added to the mystery. A blurry image of a scorched foundation and a shadowy figure that appeared behind the photographer's reflection in the glass of an old display case. The film was verified as authentic, though no one could explain the figure. By the time modern historians revisited the Bellemare case in the 2000s, almost every traceable document had vanished again, lost in unexplained archive floods, misfiling, or bureaucratic erasure. It was as if history itself was protecting the story from being told. Yet, fragments remained in private collections and whispered family tales. What makes the Bellemare scandal unique isn't only its cruelty, it's the deliberate effort to erase it. Plantation records were always detailed, but here, someone went to war against memory. Fires, missing files, silenced witnesses, all point to a conspiracy of silence. And perhaps the most chilling part of all, DNA studies conducted quietly in 2010 on local descendants from the area revealed inexplicable genetic overlaps between families of black and white ancestry, all tracing back to one property line that no longer officially existed on county maps, Bellemare Plantation. Today, no physical remains of the mansion stand. The land is privately owned, fenced off, and overgrown, but those who've walked its boundaries say the air feels heavy, as if history hasn't left. Some believe the curse of Silas Bellemare isn't supernatural but psychological, the inherited guilt of a nation built on the suffering of others. Others believe something older and darker still lingers in that Mississippi soil, feeding on the shame, the denial, and the fear of being remembered. Because history can be buried, records can be burned, but the truth, the blood truth, always finds a way to rise again. Time has a way of softening memory, but some places refuse to forget. The Bellemare Plantation, or what remains of it, stands as one of those cursed locations where the past doesn't sleep, and the air seems thick with memory, as though every gust of wind carries whispers from 1843. For more than a century after the fire, locals in Jefferson County, Mississippi spoke of the plantation ruins as a place of fear. Hunters avoided the land, farmers refused to plow its soil, even animals seemed to sense something wrong there. Birds never landed in the clearing, and dogs whined if brought too close. By the 1880s, the site had earned a chilling nickname among nearby townsfolk, the field that breathes. According to oral histories, it began with faint sounds, footsteps echoing through the burned foundations, soft crying that seemed to come from nowhere, and the smell of smoke that lingered in the air despite there being no fire for miles. But the most terrifying stories came from travelers who swore they saw figures, shadowy forms of men and women walking the fields at dusk, their heads bowed, their arms bound. One account from 1891 describes a farmer's son named Robert Kane, who rode past the old Bellemare property after sundown. He later told his mother that he saw people working in the fields, but not alive ones. He described their movements as slow and rhythmic, like the motions of those picking cotton. When he returned in daylight, there was no trace of footprints, no sign of life, only the blackened remains of the plantation's stone well. That night, Robert was found sitting on his porch, rocking back and forth, muttering, "They're still working." Stories like this spread until even neighboring towns spoke of the haunting. But it wasn't only the enslaved souls people claimed to see. Many swore that the ghost of Silas Bellemare himself roamed the land, tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers. Witnesses said he carried a whip made of fire, dragging it across the fields where his cruelty had flourished. Some believed he was not haunting the land, but trapped there, condemned to walk among those he had destroyed, forced to hear their cries for eternity. One particularly chilling tale comes from 1903, when a group of railroad workers camped near the ruins while surveying a new line. Late one night, they saw a flicker of orange light near the old mansion site. Thinking it was another campfire, two of the men went to investigate. Minutes later, they came running back, pale and shaking. They claimed they'd seen a woman standing in the middle of the field, her dress in flames, holding a baby in her arms. Her face, they said, was calm, almost peaceful, as the fire consumed her body. When they looked again, she was gone, and only ashes remained where she had stood. The men never camped there again. By the 1920s, ghost hunters and curiosity seekers began visiting the site. Some came for adventure, others came chasing the whispers of guilt buried in southern soil. One of the first recorded investigations occurred in 1924, led by a university team from New Orleans. They brought lanterns, journals, and cameras. Only 2 photographs from their trip survive today, both showing the same strange phenomenon, white mist curling upward from the earth like smoke, forming almost human shapes. The team's leader, Professor Lawrence Hobb, later wrote in his notes, "It is not the dead who haunt this place. It is the memory of what was done here. The land itself has learned to remember." Decades later, those same ruins would draw spiritualists, journalists, and even Hollywood filmmakers, all drawn to the story of the man who bred sin into blood. None stayed long. Equipment malfunctioned, sound recordings warped, and more than one person claimed to have been touched or whispered to when alone. In 1958, a reporter named Diana Keene visited the area to write a feature titled Mississippi's Lost Plantations. During her visit, she recorded what she described as unexplainable voices, faint, overlapping, and echoing through her tape recorder, even when no one was speaking. When she replayed the tape later, she heard a woman's voice whisper one word, "Remember." Her article never ran. The magazine's archives later reported that her original tape disappeared. Keene herself left journalism within a year, saying only that she didn't write about ghosts. She wrote about guilt. The haunting of Bellemare Plantation was not just about phantoms in the night, it was about the weight of truth. Every generation that tried to ignore what happened there seemed to face reminders, documents resurfacing, unexplained fires in archives, photographs vanishing from collections. It was as if the ghosts themselves refused to let history erase them again. By the 1980s, locals had fenced off the area, calling it cursed ground. Teenagers dared each other to visit at night, but few made it past the tree line. Some came back with scratches down their arms. Others said they heard heavy breathing behind them when no one was there. One boy, in 1987, swore he saw a man in 19th-century clothes staring at him from across the field, his face half burned, his eyes glowing like coals. Today, the site is overgrown and technically private property, though thrill-seekers still sneak in. The ruins are almost gone, but the air still carries the scent of smoke when the wind shifts. Paranormal investigators using modern equipment have recorded strange electromagnetic spikes and cold spots directly over where the mansion once stood. Some recordings capture what sounds like a whip crack followed by a woman's sob. But the real terror of Bellemare Plantation isn't the ghosts themselves, it's what they stand for. They are the echoes of crimes too terrible to fade, memories so violent they've scarred the earth. Every haunting, in truth, is just a story waiting to be remembered, and the ghosts of Bellemare refuse to be forgotten. One local preacher said it best when interviewed in 2003, "You don't come here to see ghosts. You come here to face what people like to pretend never happened. The dead aren't haunting us, we're haunting them." Perhaps that's the true curse of Bellemare. Not that the spirits of the enslaved still walk the land, but that their pain still lingers in the living. That even centuries later, Mississippi cannot escape the echo of screams buried in its soil, because some stories never rest, and some sins are too heavy for the ground to bury. Even after the fire had long reduced the Bellemare plantation to ashes, its story refused to die. The tale of the man who defied nature, morality, and humanity itself, Silas Bellemare, became a legend whispered across generations. But legends, especially those built on pain, rarely fade quietly. What began as a family's secret sin became a living curse that clung to Mississippi like smoke that never lifted. By the time the 20th century dawned, the Bellemare name was nearly erased from record. Local churches struck it from their archives. Courthouse registries lost documents. Even census rolls from the 1840s bore strange blank spaces where the Bellemare household should have been listed. It was as if history itself conspired to hide the evidence, to wash away the filth of a bloodline so twisted that the earth itself seemed to reject it. Yet some traces remained. In 1912, a letter surfaced in an old trunk found in a crumbling law office in Natchez. It was written in 1844, months after the fire, by a local preacher named Reverend Amos Trask. The letter, addressed to the governor of Mississippi, described what he called the unholy breeding ground of Bellemare's sin. He claimed that before his death, Silas Bellemare had sought to create his own kind, a lineage born of slavery, bound in flesh and madness. The letter mentioned that some of the children had survived. This revelation reignited curiosity about the plantation and sparked a series of quiet investigations. Church records from neighboring counties revealed strange adoptions around 1843 to 1845. 3 children, all described as unusually pale, with light eyes and a fearful silence about them, had been placed with different families under new surnames. None of those children lived past 30. According to local oral history, their deaths were unnatural. One drowned himself in a well, another was found burned in a field, and the last disappeared into the woods during a thunderstorm, leaving behind only scorched footprints in the mud. People began to say that the Bellemare curse wasn't confined to one man's sins, but had seeped into his bloodline, a corruption that twisted those who carried it. In the early 1900s, Mississippi newspapers ran small blurbs about the children of fire, speculative ghost stories inspired by the old plantation. Writers and preachers used the tale to warn against moral decay, racial mixing, and divine punishment. But what made the legend powerful wasn't just superstition, it was fear. Fear that something so monstrous could have truly happened, and that those horrors might still echo in living veins. By 1931, a journalist named Frank Leland began compiling an account titled The Bellemare Line, A Southern Study in Sin. His work gathered witness testimonies, surviving letters, and oral stories. He even claimed to have met an old woman in Yazoo County who said she was a descendant of Bellemare's enslaved offspring. According to Leland, she told him, "Our blood don't forget. Every baby born with Bellemare blood cries like it remembers burning." Leland's manuscript was never published. The publishing house that funded it burned to the ground weeks before printing. Only fragments of his notes survived, later found in a university archive, half charred, the ink still smelling faintly of smoke. The story might have remained a local ghost legend, but history has a way of surfacing what people try hardest to bury. In 1967, during construction near the old plantation site, workers uncovered a buried cellar, still intact beneath decades of overgrowth. Inside were iron restraints, rotted journals, and several small skeletal remains. The journals, now preserved in a Jackson museum, were believed to have been written by Silas's eldest son, Nathaniel Bellemare. One entry, dated May 3, 1842, reads, "Father says the Lord blessed us to be creators as he was. The women do not weep anymore. They only look at me as if I am the devil he warned them of." The journals revealed that the family had turned breeding into ritual, convinced they were building a new, pure Southern dynasty. It was the kind of evil that came not from ignorance, but from arrogance, a belief that man could play God. The discovery reignited public outrage. Historians, civil rights activists, and journalists converged on Jefferson County, demanding that the Bellemare plantation site be officially recognized as a historical site of atrocity. But local authorities resisted. Landowners feared the stigma, and older families, many descended from the county's antebellum elite, preferred silence, Still, the story refused to die. In the 1990s, author Elaine Marin published Ashes of Belmare, a haunting blend of history and folklore that traced the plantation's legacy through modern Mississippi families. Marin interviewed dozens of locals who claimed to experience unexplainable events, dreams of fire, phantom cries at night, or seeing figures in the field even though the plantation had been gone for more than a century. One woman recounted that her grandfather used to warn children never to play near the swamp by the Belmare ruins, saying, "That's where the burned ones still breathe." Perhaps the most chilling detail Marin uncovered was a genetic study conducted by a local university in 1997. Without revealing names, it noted a rare blood anomaly found in several families across southern Mississippi, a mutation in a specific gene that caused light sensitivity and rapid tissue scarring. The study never connected the dots publicly, but locals did. They called it the Belmare mark. Today, the plantation story has become part of Mississippi's darker heritage, a cautionary tale about how cruelty leaves stains that time cannot erase. Documentaries, podcasts, and even modern ghost tours whisper its name, turning what was once a family's hidden evil into a reflection of the South's haunted conscience. But beyond the legends, one truth endures. The legacy of Belmare is not about ghosts, curses, or bloodlines. It's about what happens when power turns to possession, when one man's obsession with control consumes generations. Silas Belmare believed he could master life and death, bend human will, and shape bloodlines like clay. In the end, his name became synonymous with everything the South wanted to forget: the greed, the cruelty, and the madness that slavery unleashed not only upon its victims, but upon those who wielded it. And so, in the whispers of the burned fields and the unmarked graves that litter Mississippi's soil, the echo of his sin remains. For every secret the earth swallows, there is always one that refuses to stay buried. And some legacies, no matter how hard you try to silence them, are written in blood, smoke, and screams that never die.